teaching and so on. So my involvement with Azerbaijan has been very long-standing. And I did some consultancy work as well in Azerbaijan. I went to the south of Azerbaijan, Lankaran region, which is on the border with Iran, where actually the position of women is even worse there because there's more patriarchal, a bit more prejudice. I haven't published on that, but I did produce reports for the Organization of Security and Cooperation in Europe, OSCE, which was the body that employed me to go and do the consultancy work there. And that was very interesting. Now, I should, well, this talk has got a very broad remit because I think you decided in my previous two talks on Wednesday and Thursday, I was at Boston University and then at Harvard Davis Center for Eurasian and Russian Studies. I was talking about Central Asia and women there. But today I was asked to also talk about Azerbaijan and sort of compare it. But I can start by saying that there are a lot of parallels if we're talking about the position of women in these formerly Soviet Muslim countries, in that it's very paradoxical and there are a lot of anomalies in the sense that on the one hand they have the legacies of the Soviet system, which was gender equality, so the laws have incorporated that and not only Soviet times but post-Soviet also, the laws give women a lot of, there's a lot of equality in the laws. But in practice, because of the patriarchal traditions and male-biased traditions that have been, centuries old, there is that sort of paradox between the de facto and de jure situation. So that in laws they are very equal, but in practice there are a lot of inequalities because of the male chauvinism and because of prejudices and so on. But there is also, of course, a lot of other factors come into the picture. In Kyrgyzstan, if I start with there is that question of, both in Kyrgyzstan and Uzbekistan, the question of violence against women is quite a prominent question affecting women's lives. And this is something which has increased in the post-Soviet period, partly, I think, because of the poverty. As you know, with the breakup of the Soviet Union, there was a lot of economic difficulties was created, and the welfare state was greatly weakened, welfare provisions really reduced, and this of course affects women a lot, even more than it affects men, because women traditionally have been the caregiver in the family. So this breakdown in the welfare provisions has affected them a lot. And there's that question of, and in Kyrgyzstan also being a poor country, the question of poverty is very major question. So the violence is partly to do with this sort of poverty, but also to do with the weakening of the laws, the insecurity that was created because the law enforcement bodies, because of the corruption that exists, and the problem with corruption and difficulties in enforcing the laws, the weakness of the police force and so on, it means that the violence against women is not really dealt with properly. The NGOs, there have been some NGOs have been created to defend women's rights and help with women's situation, but they are not so well funded and they are not so strong. And the whole question of feminism actually is something which in the Soviet era, this is the old legacy from the beginning of the Russian Revolution, that feminism was something that was frowned upon because it was considered to be weakening the sort of the proletarian movement, the proletarian struggle, because it was assumed that if we have equality, then if we have socialism, then we have equality, in which case we don't need to have something defend women's rights, because everybody's rights is being defended and so on. So feminists were seen as a kind of a distraction. So there isn't that background like in the West. We have had the feminism which has been going on, especially since the 1960s and 70s and 80s and so on, getting stronger and defending women's rights and supporting women and so on. Nevertheless, there is some women's NGOs have started working and do exist, both in Bishkek and also in Azerbaijan, in Baku, especially a bit, maybe even stronger. In terms of what I said, the violence against women, there was that question of poverty mixed with lawlessness and the weak laws, implementation of the laws. Now, in Kyrgyzstan, one of the manifestations of this is this whole issue of bride kidnapping. Now, bride kidnapping is something which is, it happens in a lot of places, and there is a tradition of it actually in the Caucasus and in Azerbaijan also, but that's something which is more historical. It's in modern times, it's very rare. It would be more elopement rather than strictly, non-consensual kind of bride kidnapping. But in Kyrgyzstan, it was a tradition which actually continued during the Soviet period. And in the post-Soviet period, it increased. And this increase may seem strange from the outside point of view, but again, this question of poverty on the one hand and lawlessness on the other hand have combined to help to increase this. And it's very strange, actually. It may seem odd, but the mothers involved, the mothers of the young men involved, actually encourage this, because the girl who is brought into the family is seen as a spare sort of pair of hands and a help, because she has to service the family, the gelin, the young bride. Now, you may ask why I got interested in this. The background to this goes back to when I first started teaching at the American University. Soon after about maybe a month or two, I came across a couple of the students whom I saw very distraught, crying, very unhappy, and I asked what the problem was, and they told me that one of them, the sister, they had just come back from the funeral of the sister, and I asked, well, what happened? And they said that the girl was, she was actually an art student, very interested to become an artist and very good at art. But she was lured into going into a party one evening. Friends invited her, and then at the end of the night, this young man kidnapped her, and she didn't want to be married to this guy who was kidnapping her, and so she attempted to escape. But in the process, she fell into a river and she drowned. And then the friend of the girl whose sister had gone through, to whom this had happened, told me that she thought that actually the girl had been raped and so on, because there were these injuries on her body after they discovered her. So I was very shocked and very distraught by this, and I said to these girls, well, you must go after the culprits, you must get the police to arrest the guys who did this. This is a terrible thing. And their reaction was something that really shocked me and baffled me, because their reaction was, oh, what can we do? It's our culture.
Excuse me, where was that?
Sorry?
That's
Where?
in Kyrgyzstan.
Where? In Kyrgyzstan, in Bishkek,
Okay.
I'm talking about. The region where this a lot happens and they take the girls to is a remote region in the Actually, that's something I forgot. I was going to ask you to put a map of Kyrgyzstan. Sorry, a map of Kyrgyzstan for you to see the locations. Because Narin is a region of Kyrgyzstan which is in the east, on the Chinese border. And that's the remote part, and it's very traditional. They have maintained their traditions mostly there. And this was also where they were going to take this girl. Anyway, their reaction saying, well, it's in our culture. So that really baffled me, and I thought, well, I must research this. I must find out to what extent this is part of the culture. So that's how I started on this research. And then I continued, and I found out as I went along more and more, I found out that actually, yes, it is very common. Not so much among the educated men, young men, because then they see it beneath them, you know, to have to steal a girl to marry, or amongst the elite. But mostly among the poorer guys and sort of working class, rural, poorer guys, it's much more common. But among my students, there were quite a few who told me that like their brothers had kidnapped their wives, their father had kidnapped their mother, and so it turned out to be a lot more common. And also there was a study done by an American professor who came there in, I think it was about 2000, 2001, who had done a study who found that there was amongst this kidnappings that were done, there was like 1/3 of them were non-consensual, although 1/3 were consensual, so there were like elopement arranged between them, but there were at least 1/3 who were non-consensual. And this is a tragedy. This kind of situation is a tragedy because obviously, you know, being kidnapped for marriage, and often what you find that there is violence involved, or the girls lose the opportunity then to continue or finish their education, because usually after marriage very quickly they get pregnant, they have children, and then they're stuck and so on. So now in the book there is all these very interesting episodes that I have told in the book. But I must also add that not every case is the girls submit to it. There's also resistance, and there are some successful cases where the girls have resisted and managed to get out of it. But there is, I'm sorry, I have to finish talking and then I will answer questions. There was one NGO in Narin where, in the book I've called Narin the capital of bride kidnapping, because I found that there was a lot happening there. But there was also an NGO there that was dealing with this, and giving training to girls and trying to educate young girls how to resist, how to protest, how to become aware of their rights. Because in the laws, it's illegal. There is a penalty, there is imprisonment. But despite the illegality, this happens. And in fact, it was happening in the Soviet times. And as I said, the paradoxes, anomalies, that in the Soviet times, apart from bride kidnapping that was happening despite being illegal, there was also polygamy that was happening despite being illegal. And of course, in the post-Soviet time, this polygamy situation in Kyrgyzstan, poor country, in some ways is increased, because the women, especially if a guy is, say, a businessman or is well off, and you know, after the breakup of the Soviet Union, then some people went into business and became rich. And so these guys can easily afford to have a second wife, and are not so happy to keep with their old wives, especially if the old wife has got some illness or is not so strong, or is getting old or whatever. And with the poverty, of course, the young women, or the women, not necessarily young, maybe middle-aged, but if there is a man who is going to support them and become their husband, they're quite happy to become a second wife. So I did interview some women who had become second wives. But the way they do it, of course, is by having religious marriage, which is called nikah in Muslim marriage. Nikah, they become the second wife. So these are the sort of paradoxes of that sort of Soviet situation.
It's in Kyrgyzstan, right? Not Azerbaijan. Or, yeah,
No, I was talking about Kyrgyzstan. Yeah, Kyrgyzstan and now among the poor in Azerbaijan, I don't know. There may be some. I mean, poor woman with a rich man. I'm talking about, not both of the poor. But in now. Another question here, apart from these questions, of course, there's also, perhaps I should mention the political situation. You'd be interested in these countries. As you may be aware, Kyrgyzstan is actually the most sort of liberal, relatively speaking, liberal and democratic of the stands, the four stands. And also, if we want to include Azerbaijan as well, politically, in terms of repression. Culturally, Azerbaijan is fairly free, it doesn't have so much repression. But politically, and with dictatorship, yes, there is also there. But Kyrgyzstan is like the most, on the continuum, if you like, is to the far left of them. And Uzbekistan is one of the worst. And I have talked a lot in the book about Uzbekistan as well. They had the dictatorship under Karimov, who actually passed away a couple of weeks ago. But I don't think there's going to be much change, the person who's going to replace him. But one side effect of this dictatorship was that Uzbekistan was a bit like a police state. And when I was there also, I witnessed that the fact that, you go from, especially going from Tashkent to other cities, if you're traveling, you have all these checkpoints. You're constantly under observation and being checked. And to actually live in Tashkent, you have to get special permit or be married to somebody who lives there. So it's not so easy. You can't just, coming from another town, you can't just move there and live there. And I suppose these are some of the old legacies of the Soviet system, where you had a lot of restrictions on movement and mobility and so on. But having that police state in Uzbekistan means that on the streets, ironically, you've got more security. So, it's a little bit safer on the street than, say, Kyrgyzstan, where with poverty and all that, you've got more insecurity, more crime, and so on. But corruption is unfortunately a very big problem in these countries. In Kyrgyzstan, you could buy off the imprisonment, you could buy off the sentences, like there was so many dollars for a jail sentence of, I don't know, some crime or other, and it was like, even for a murder, it was like, I can't remember now, $10,000 or something, you could buy it off. So this is, this of course affects women in the sense that if they are subject to violence, if they have the husband or the partner who beats them up and abuses them and so on, if he's got any kind of influence, or if he's rich, he can buy off the police and get away with it. Now, with Azerbaijan, what's happened is that in Azerbaijan also there's a lot of similarities, but there is a distinct difference in that Azerbaijan is closer to Europe, and the regime in Azerbaijan has been, even though it's kind of left over of the Soviet system, Heydar Aliyev, he was also actually he was in the Politburo of the Soviet Union, or perhaps the only good thing of that was that they were strongly secular and wanted to enforce secularism rather than any sort of religious or that ideology. And this secular outlook, of course, helps women because they become more inclined to enforce gender equality, at least in laws, maybe not so much in practice, but in the laws. Now, with Azerbaijan, over the last number of years, they have been also, because they aspire to be close to Europe and to be involved in European institutions, like they joined the Council of Europe, for example, and the long-term aim is perhaps they can have some associate membership of EU or some kind of European sort of association. Because of that, they have tried to make the laws also more close to European laws in terms of gender. I'm now talking about not so much in democratic terms, but in terms of gender equality and women's rights. So years ago, they set up this committee, State Committee for Women, which then later they diluted it a bit by calling it State Committee for Women and Family, Women and Children. So they made it broader. But anyway, still it's looking after women's affairs. So they have done some work in that respect. And about in 2006, OSCE, the Organization for Security in Europe, wanted to bring in, they considered actually, I mean, it was written into their charter, that they considered gender equality as one of the important principles to try and increase security, because they saw that as an important element. You know, if in the society there is more gender equality and better position for women, the society is going to be more secure and it's going to help with security. So they set up this this kind of division, and I was asked at that time, 2006, to do a report on the position of women in the south, in Lankaran region, which is on the border with Iran. Now, Lankaran is a more sort of traditional, if you like, and Islamic beliefs and practices are a little bit stronger there. They are more, and being neighbors of Iran also, they're more influenced by that, by what happened in Iran with the Islamic Revolution. And also there was the intrusion from Iran by, you know, like Iranian regime was sending these mullahs for some time, because afterwards the Azerbaijani government tried to stop it, and they also local municipalities tried to get rid of these people who were coming from Iran and trying to propagate this kind of radical Shiism. But anyway, I went there for this study. I did a study on the position of women there and produced a report for them. And the aim was, which I was very happy about, because I do have a background in this. In London, I set up, well, I was the chief person involved in setting up Iranian women's Iranian community, and the division of that, we set up a women's section to help with supporting women and promoting their rights and educating them and so on. So I was very happy to be involved in this setting up a women's center in Lankaran, which was a little bit of a revolution for Lankaran, which if this happened. Unfortunately, I did all the work and produced all the report and everything, but at the end it didn't come off. At the end they didn't give us the budget and we didn't set up the center. But at least did the study and so on. But we did put on a conference about violence against women, and invited some, and I was involved in that, invited some speakers from different places and did a study and had very interesting discussions about this violence, you know, what are the roots of it and what promotes it, and what's the attitude of the men, and to what extent men need to be educated about this issue, because it's a very difficult and very delicate issue, this issue, and it's very subtle. It's not so clear. It's not so much in the surface. It's more under the surface. And there's a question of the cultural sort of features are involved here, like the question of shame, that women are not always ready to go and complain and to go and expose the situation because it's considered shameful. It's preferred that they would go to deal with it and solve it within the family rather than go to the authorities. And that is one of the problems. And talking about the shame, I should also mention that this business of bride kidnapping in Kyrgyzstan, one of the what may seem odd things is that the girls who were kidnapped, their families were reluctant to take the girls back, because once the girl had been kidnapped and spent a night or a day at the man's house, she was a bit considered, although it was never articulated, but she was considered a bit like a soiled material. So, you know, it was shameful. And this question of shame, honor and shame, are the sort of principles that really affect women's situation. And there needs to be sort of cultural changes and education, you know, to enlighten people and to deal with these problems. Now, okay, so this is the sort of general overlook I've given you. But I must talk also about the youth. That was another theme I was going to mention, about the youth in these countries and the future. Fortunately, what's happening is that although the older generation were very much influenced by the Soviet system and impressed by the sort of Russian culture and influenced by the Russian culture and Russified, both in terms of their education, the language, and so on. But the younger generation, by younger I mean, say, under 35 or under 40, especially under 30, you know, in their 20s or late teens, their outlook is very much towards the West, Europe and the US. And what really influences this, of course, is the effect of the media on the one hand, effect of the internet on the other hand, all these influences that have come in. And also, I should add here NGOs as well, that there have been the NGOs, especially in Kyrgyzstan. In Uzbekistan, unfortunately, the regime kicked out all the NGOs and doesn't want, it really keeps the society closed in. But in Kyrgyzstan, there was it's quite a thriving scene with the NGOs. In Azerbaijan also there have been some, but of these NGOs, I should say, the organization that I think has had a very positive effect, and I see it as a very positive thing. One of the positive things that US has done is this establishment of Peace Corps, the Peace Corps volunteers. I think they do a great job in those countries. Now, I don't know in other places, but in those countries, in the like in Kyrgyzstan, in Central Asia, and in Azerbaijan, they have very good effect because they are volunteers, the educated young people who go there and go to, sometimes they go to remote places, to villages, small towns, and they bring in both the English language and the Western ideas, the Western culture, and these notions of gender equality and respect for women and all these sort of attitudes and notions. They bring all this. So I think Peace Corps, I think, has been a very good and positive influence in these places. Now, hopefully, I should say that looking towards the future, I think the youth is the youth is the future, is the hope for the future relies with the youth, and with more education, more contact with the West, contact with the rest of the world, you know, they would kind of promote both the democratic principles, ideas of democracy, gender equality, and also, I should add finally, the intergenerational sort of equality or intergenerational, let's say, not strict equality, because there's still the cultural ideas of respect for the elders, which I think is a good thing that they have that as part of it, but not so much the old-fashioned ideas that the parents can sort of dictate everything to the kids. It's more sort of freedom for the young. This is something which is also being promoted, and is something which is also developing and advancing with the youth. Okay.
Okay, thank
Any
you.
questions?